Probably the most famous single theme in music is that which opens Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And today, the distinguished American composer and conductor, Mr. Leonard Bernstein, is going to show us what this theme and two others from the same symphony meant to Beethoven. When he wrote this symphony, he was going blind, and he'd gone deaf long ago. So he had to trust to his imagination rather than his ears. And Mr. Bernstein will show us how, being a triumphant genius, he was able to do this. Mr. Bernstein will have the assistance of an orchestra that will then play the whole of the first movement of the Fifth Symphony. And you may not be familiar with the name of this orchestra, its present name, which is the Symphony of the Air, but surely under its old famous name of the NBC Symphony Orchestra, the orchestra that refused to die when its leader, Toscanini, retired. Instead, it was reorganized, it set up a foundation and hopes with public support to establish itself as a permanent national orchestra. Now you will see the evolution of a masterpiece, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in C minor.
We are going to try to perform for you today a curious and rather difficult experiment. We are going to take the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and rewrite it. Now, don't get scared. We're going to use only notes that Beethoven himself wrote. We're going to take certain discarded sketches that Beethoven wrote, intending to use them in this symphony, and find out why he rejected them by putting them back into the symphony and seeing how the symphony would have sounded with them. Then we can guess at the reasons for his rejecting these sketches, and what is more important, perhaps we can get a glimpse into the composer's mind as it moves through this mysterious creative process we call composing. Now, we have here painted on the floor a reproduction of the first page of the conductor's score of Beethoven's Fifth. I am amazed every time I look at this music all over again at how simple and strong and right it is, and how economical the music is. Why, every bar in this movement is based in one way or another directly on these four notes, 3 G's and an E flat. What is it about these 3 G's and an E flat, 3 eighth notes and a half note, that are so pregnant and so meaningful that a whole symphonic movement can be born of them? They're 3 G's and an E flat, nothing more. Anybody could have thought of them, maybe. People have been wondering for years just what it is that endows this musical figure with such potency. All kinds of silly music appreciation theories have arisen. I'm sure you remember some of them from school, that it's fate knocking at the door, that it's the trumpets announcing the judgment day, that it's a bird that sang in the Vienna woods that Beethoven overheard, that it's V for victory. Oh, there are millions of them, and none of them actually tell us a thing. Because the truth of the matter is that the real meaning of this figure lies in all the notes which follow it, in all the notes of all the 500 measures of music that follow it in this first movement. And Beethoven, more than any other composer before or after him, I think, had the ability to find the exactly right notes that had to follow his themes. But even he, with this great ability, had a gigantic struggle to achieve this rightness. And it's that struggle that we would like to investigate. Now, actually, there are 2 struggles involved that every composer has. One is to find the right notes for themes. The other is to find the right notes to follow themes, to justify these themes as symphonic themes. We're all pretty familiar with the first struggle, We've all, no doubt, seen Schumann and Brahms on the silver screen, laboring over the keyboard, searching for those right notes. We have all been privileged to see Jimmy Cagney impersonating George M. Cohan, I think it was in Yankee Doodle Dandy, sitting over a keyboard, dramatically alone on a deserted stage, with a solitary work light standing next to him, picking out the immortal notes of Over There. You remember? And then he had it, Over There, and in came the whole symphony orchestra and 500-voice chorus with the finished product. Well, Beethoven shared in this same struggle in a very real way. We know from his notebooks that he wrote down at least 14 versions of the melody that opens the second movement of this symphony. The melody we know today as this. "14 versions over a period of 8 years. But here is one of the earliest versions, which is very different indeed. Here's another one, again very different in style and feeling. And after 8 years of experimenting with 12 others, he finally arrived at a solution whereby he combined the most interesting elements, the most graceful elements of all of them, and finally arrived at the one that is familiar to us today. All right, Beethoven has found his theme, but now the fun really begins. Now the big struggle begins, because Beethoven must now find the symphonic entity that must grow out of this theme. And this theme we can understand in its symphonic meaning only after we have arrived at the very last note of the entire movement. Thus, the famous 4 notes that we heard at the opening are not in themselves susceptible of meaning in the music appreciation sense. They are rather a springboard for the continuity of the rest of the symphonic movement. That, after all, is the real function of what we call form. Form is not a mold for jello into which we pour notes and expect the result to be a rondo or a minuet or a sonata in an automatic way. The real function of form is to take us on a varied and complicated journey. And to do this, the composer has to have a corresponding inner roadmap. He has to know what the next destination is going to be. In other words, he's got to know what the next note has to be. He must convey to us a sense of rightness, a sense that whatever note succeeds the last is the only possible note that can rightly happen at that instant. Now, as we said before, Beethoven had this ability more than anybody before or after him, but it was a great struggle. Now let's try to follow this struggle. To begin with, Beethoven chose to use 12 different instruments to comprise his orchestra in the first movement of the Fifth Symphony. Starting at the top of the page of the conductor's score, we find first the flute, then the oboe, the clarinet, the bassoon, the horn, the trumpet, the timpani, the first violin, the second violin, the viola, the cello, and the double bass. Now, of course, the full orchestra is made up of these 12 instruments multiplied anywhere from 2 to 18 times. As the conductor views this score, his eye has to follow all these 12 instruments simultaneously across the page. However, for his opening few bars, Beethoven did not wish the entire orchestra to be playing, and so he dismissed 5 of these 12 instruments. First the oboe, then the bassoon, horn, trumpet, and timpani. Here is the manuscript as he started it, with the remaining 7 instruments accounted for. But there is something crossed out, the flute part. So we know that Beethoven, at least for a second, was going to include the flute in his opening. Now, why did he cross it out? Let's hear how it would have sounded with the flute left in. You hear those high piping tones of the flute? They don't seem somehow to fit into the brusque, rude atmosphere of this opening. Beethoven clearly wanted the strongest, most masculine utterance he could get at the beginning of this symphony, and he therefore decided to orchestrate entirely with instruments that play normally in the register of the male speaking or singing voice. The flute, of course, is the instrumental equivalent of a soprano voice, and therefore is intruding here like a delicate lady at a club smoker. So out came the flute. Now let's see how masculine it sounds without him. You see, many of us assume that when we hear the symphony today, it sounds so simple and right that it must have spilled out of Beethoven in one steady gush. But not at all. Beethoven left pages and pages of discarded material similar to these sketches here, enough to fill a whole book. He rejected, he rewrote, he tore up, he crossed out. He sometimes altered passages as much as 20 times. We can see some of those alterations here in this facsimile of the original manuscript score. Look at that. Look at those agonized changes, those feverish scrolls. Why, here it's been crossed out so many times that there doesn't seem to be any room anymore. In fact, there isn't room anymore for the right notes, the final version, which he had to write down at the bottom of the page as a kind of footnote, leaving it to the copyists to figure out what he meant. I admire and pity those poor copyists. Now, just as contrast, let's look at a score by Igor Stravinsky. Look how neat, how unagonized. It looks almost as beautiful as it sounds. Now, before Beethoven began to write this wild-looking thing, he had been filling notebooks for around 3 years with sketches. We have some of these sketches here, some that he ultimately discarded as not being right. I've been fiddling with the music and trying to figure out what this first movement would have sounded like if some of these sketches had been left in. I've been experimenting, speculating on where he might have intended them for use and how they would have affected the progress of the whole piece. I've come up with some curious and interesting results. Let's see what they are. We already know the opening bars of the symphony, almost too well, I should say. Now, we also know the answer to this. Good. Now Beethoven has made his initial statement. What does he do now? How does he go on to develop it? This is the way he goes on to develop it. Fine. But here is a discarded sketch, which is also a direct and immediate development of those same 4 notes. It goes like this. It's not very good, not very bad, taken all by itself, but it is a good, logical development of the opening figure. Now, what would the music have sounded like if Beethoven had used this sketch as the immediate development of his theme? We can find out easily enough by simply putting it back into the symphony, and then it will sound like this. There is a difference, isn't there? Not only because it sounds wrong to our ears, which are accustomed to the version we know, but because of the very nature of the music itself. This sketch is so symmetrical. In other words, whatever the right hand does, the left hand imitates in a kind of monkey-like way. This makes for a quality of being static. It doesn't seem to want to go anywhere. And that's fatal at the outset of a journey, especially of a symphonic journey. It doesn't seem to have that mystery and whispered promise of things to come that the right version has. Instead, this sketch music gets stuck in its own repetitions. It just doesn't build. And Beethoven was first and foremost a builder. Now, let's look at another rejected sketch. Here's one that sounds like this. Again, it is based, as all of them are, on the opening four notes. Now, I am guessing that Beethoven would have used it somewhere in this passage. Now, let's have the same passage with this discarded sketch included. I find it's terrible. I feel that this sketch just intrudes itself into the living flow of the music and stands there grounded, unable to move, until it's over, and then the music can take off in its flight again. No wonder Beethoven rejected it, because he, of all people, had a sense of drive throughout his music that is second to none. But this sketch just doesn't drive. It is again, like the first one, static and stuck. Now, this sketch is different. This has real excitement and build in it. I suspect that it was intended for a spot a little later on in the movement, this spot. This is certainly one of the most thrilling and climactic points in the whole symphony. It is the beginning of the coda, or the big push just before the end. Let's see how it would have sounded using the sketch I just played. Not at all bad, actually. It has logic and it builds. But the version Beethoven finally did use has so much more logic and builds with so much more ferocity and shock that there is no comparison. While this sketch here, although good, seems pale beside it. So on. Now, here is a sketch that I really like because it seems to have the essential Beethoven style. In fact, it reminds me a little bit of the Pathétique Sonata for piano. This has pain in it and mystery and a certain sense of eruption. It would have fitted very neatly into that same coda, but further on in the coda, harmonically, rhythmically, in every way except emotionally. This is the spot I mean. Now let's hear the same passage with this sketch added. Do you hear the difference? What has actually happened? We had to come down from a high point to a low point in order to build dramatically up again to a still higher point. This is not unacceptable dramatic structure. It happens all the time in plays as well as in music. But this isn't the moment for it. Beethoven has already hit his high level. This is already in the last lap of the movement, and he wants to maintain this high level to the bitter end. And this he does do, a very difficult thing to do. He does it with astonishing brilliance. It is this genius of his for going forward, always forward, that guides his hand in every case when he is struggling with his material. Why, even the very ending of this movement was written in 3 different ways, right on the facsimile of the orchestra score that you saw a moment ago. The first way sounds like this. This is a typical abrupt Beethoven-ish ending. But he didn't like it. For some reason, I suspect, because he thought it was too abrupt, he wrote a second one, which he made more extended, more noble, more romantic, more majestic, more like what we tend to think of as a finale. And that one went like this. But this one, too, as you see in the manuscript, is crossed out. Apparently, Beethoven thought that it was too long, too pretentious, perhaps too majestic. It didn't seem to fit into the scheme of the first movement, where the keynote is bare, pithy, forthright statement of the utmost force. And so he tried still a third ending, and this one worked. But the odd thing is that, as it turned out, this third ending is even more abrupt than the first ending was. So you see, Beethoven had to struggle and agonize for all this time in order to arrive at what is apparently so simple a thing, that his first ending didn't have the trouble of being too abrupt, but rather not abrupt enough. And so out came finally this third ending, which is as right as rain. And so Beethoven came to the end of this long symphonic journey, at least for one movement. Imagine a lifetime of this struggle, movement after movement, symphony after symphony, quartet after concerto after sonata, always probing and rejecting in this constant dedication to perfection, to the principle of inevitability. Somehow this is the key, the only key we can have to the mystery of a great artist, that for reasons unknown to him or to anybody else for that matter, he will give away his life and his energies just to make sure that one note follows another with complete inevitability. Seems rather an odd way to spend one's life, but it isn't so odd when we think that the composer, by doing this, leaves us at the finish with a feeling that something is right in the world, that checks throughout, something that follows its own law consistently, something we can trust that will never let us down.
Now Mr. Bernstein crosses to the podium to conduct the Symphony of the Air in the first movement of Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 in C minor.
Thank you.